Welcome, everybody. Thanks for joining us this morning, and appreciate your participation in what was an event that we pulled together pretty quickly, just in the last couple of weeks. We're at a moment of going from one presidential administration to a new presidential administration. It's a natural time to take stock on some of the specific initiatives that have occurred over the last 4 years and begin to think about the lessons for place-based policy that we can take forward with us as we, which is something that's been central to the work that we're doing at the Reimagining the Economy Project at Harvard Kennedy School. We have been interested in taking the very long view of place-based policy, understanding the different policy experiments that the federal government and state and local governments have conducted over the last 120 years or so, as we get a sense of what seems to work, what seems to not work, and how does our understanding of the effectiveness of policy change as the broader economy changes. So we're delighted to have with us today three folks who've been central in the implementation of place-based and industrial policy in the United States during the last several years. We have with us Dan Kim, who's the chief economist for CHIPS in the U.S. Department of Commerce, Alex Jones, who's director of the Build Back Regional Challenge in the Economic Development Administration, and Nell Abernathy, who's the director of the Office of Policy and Strategic Planning in the Department of Commerce. So our format for today is that I'm going to give each of the panelists about 10 minutes to offer some reflections, and we'll go in the order of Dan, Alex, and Nell. And what we'd like you to do in those reflections is to take a step back and say, okay, if we look at the recent set of initiatives that the federal government has undertaken, what were the objectives that we were trying to achieve? We often get lost in the minutia of policy details, whereas for learning long-term, keeping those objectives front and center is of singular importance. Also, for learning about policy is mechanisms for evaluation. So to give us your sense of what mechanisms did the federal government put in place that helps us understand the effectiveness of the actions that have been undertaken. In choosing how to allocate funding that's been authorized by the different domains of place-based policy from that were part of Build Back Better, that were part of the Inflation Reduction Act, that were part of the CHIPS and Science Act, you had to make choices about kind of who got what. And those choices might have been made by particular offices in some instances, and might have been made by more complicated collectives. So giving us a sense of how regions and industries and even individual firms were selected. And then finally, what we've seen is a tremendous amount of policy experimentation in the last 4 years. And as we were to look forward, imagine a group of policymakers 10 years from now or 15 years from now saying, we now want to think about regional or industrial policy initiatives to deal with the challenges that the U.S. economy will have at that moment in time. What for you are kind of the singular lessons you would want folks to take away? So we'll have Dan and Alex and Nell give their remarks. Then what we'll do is have a moderated conversation in which I'll be presenting you all with questions. And then at the end of that, we will transition to Q&A with the audience. And looking forward to that discussion, I will just ask folks to raise their hands when we get to that part of the conversation. So with that, Dan, let me invite you to give our some opening remarks.
All right. Well, thank you for inviting me to this event. Really, it's a pleasure to be here. I haven't had an opportunity to put on an academic hat for quite a while, just having been in government and executing this program. And come to think of it, I have had the pleasure of serving in the public sector across the Obama, Trump 1, the Biden administration, and now going to Trump 2. So hopefully I'll bring a perspective that isn't just in the moment of the election cycle that we lived through, but about industrial policy and about economic development overall. So let me just share some perspectives from the CHIPS program office, of which I'm the chief economist. It's a fancy sounding title, but there's only one economist here, of course, and I am the chief among them. So I just wanted to just state that there. Just a personal anecdote is I was invited to the signing ceremony of the CHIPS and Science Act bill passing. And I just remember it being an incredibly hot and humid day in Washington, D.C. And I just, looked across the lawn, and there was a friend of mine who was at the Commerce Department at the time, and I was in the private sector working as a chief economist of a major semiconductor company. And there were a lot of excitement at this signing ceremony, but this friend of mine who was at the Commerce Department, who had been looking at semiconductor issues for a while, did not look particularly happy. And I asked him why he didn't look so happy, and he said, "Well, now we actually have to go and execute this thing after the bill had been signed, and it's really hard. The United States government has not really undertaken an industrial and investment policy targeted for a particular industry like this for a very long time. We were essentially given a blank check, not necessarily a blank check, a large sum of money, $50 billion for both manufacturing incentives and R&D programs, with a mandate to build more semiconductors and to strengthen our national and economic security. But the details were left up to the Commerce Department to execute, to your point. And so we had to build a team, and then build a program from scratch, and to make sure that we got an outcome that we thought was desirable. And so that was a daunting task, to start from a blank slate. And they asked me to come in and help execute the program. More importantly, to place a vision as to what a success would look like, and then point us a direction as to how to get there and what kind of investments we need by which companies to make that a successful thing. And in any strategy development, you need an assessment of fundamentals of what is missing and what a good outcome should be. And then you sort of chart a pathway to go there. And the way that I saw it was that there were three things that were missing from the semiconductor ecosystem in the United States. Remember, we invented semiconductor manufacturing in the United States, and the manufacturing ecosystem has atrophied significantly from about the late 90s. Just to give you a context, in 1963, towards the beginning of the semiconductor invention and industry development, about 60% of the chips that were made here in the United States, and the US was making most of the chips at the time, in the early 60s, 60% of the chips made in the US was consumed by the Apollo program for space exploration. And so the US government really did have a lot of say as to what kinds of chips were being demanded and really pushing that industry along. That's no longer the case. You see chips being consumed everywhere. The fact that we're having this call right now over Zoom means there are thousands of chips in our PCs, at servers, in our mobile phones, wherever you're listening to, enabling all of this, our modern life. Anything that has an on and off switch will have semiconductors. A lot more companies, a lot more regions have semiconductor manufacturing, and a lot more demanders as well. So how did we lose our way? And the way I saw it, I sort of put to my team that we need to focus on 3 C's, if you don't mind me sort of just explaining all this, just from an academic perspective. One was capacity, the other one was capability, and the other one was competitiveness. And I'll just go through each of these really quick, and then I'll get to the questions that you're getting at, Gordon. One is capacity. We just don't have as many factories, just manufacturing presence in semiconductors as we used to, and as we need to be in the world, and based on our consumption. Whether it is high volume production for products that are billions of units in volume, or tens or dozens for specific types, we were lacking the capacity to build things here. So that's the first C that we were missing. The second C that we were missing was capability, which I would define as the ability to create technical roadmaps for end users, and a portfolio of those technologies, and the ability to create the next generation set of technical roadmaps. So for example, if you're trying to develop a medical device or a mobile device or an AI chip, where can I go that has a technology roadmap in the semiconductor manufacturing space? What region, countries, or companies can I go to to have that technical roadmap? Do they have the capability of innovation that I could rely on for the next 10, 20 years? Do we have that in the United States? And my answer at the time would have been no, we didn't have that, right? Which is very concerning. And then the third C is competitiveness. We could look at a lot of different ways of defining competitiveness, but we simply didn't have cost competitiveness. Our unit manufacturing cost was not very good. And our tech competitiveness also was not very good. We had lost process leadership, meaning, do we have the latest technology innovation here in the United States or not? We had lost that years ago, and it was, and we need to get that back. So if we're looking at those C's and how to solve that, then how do we design a program to get to a place where we could invite those back? And so we actually created a notice of funding opportunity. We call it NOFO here. We're very big on acronyms here in the government, but we did it in a very transparent way. We put out evaluation criteria by specific sets of technologies that we were looking for. We had done our homework here internally as to identifying the specific technologies and capacities that we thought were the most critical to have in the United States based on their economic and national security value. We were not looking to create an autarky. We were not looking to necessarily crowd everything in here or be completely self-sufficient necessarily. But we identified technologies that we thought were critical. And we had done some internal homework here as to what we thought were general reasonable allocation of those funds, and then put out a notice of funding opportunity that essentially laid out the criteria that we were looking for, done a variety of seminars, and did a lot of industry engagements. The semiconductor industry is very top-heavy. About 60% of the CapEx spent in the industry is done by the top 5 companies. And so it is top-heavy, and those companies really dictate where the capacity and the capability will be built. And so we really needed to engage with those companies for the high-volume manufacturing, but also many others when it comes to specialized and mature technologies. And we essentially made a list of companies that we thought were critical for them to be here. We were also, of course, had an open process and evaluated everything that came in through a transparent process. That required building a team here. We now have a team of about 200 people. That is a mix of industry experts, policy experts, financial experts that are able to take evaluations from beginning to the finish line, engage with the applicants, engage with those customers to the extent that they were allowed to do that, to make sure that there's commercial viability and financial viability to those projects, and take them from 0 to 100 and allocate those funds. That's a lot, and we're really happy with the results that we have been able to accomplish. The result of our program has been that we have unlocked about $450 billion worth of private sector investments in the next coming decade or so, with the $38 billion of manufacturing incentives that we have. That's a really good return for our funds. And we're really pleased with the fact that all 5 of the leading edge logic and DRAM, advanced memory product manufacturers are here building in significant ways, and they will all have presence here in terms of manufacturing and their research here. And so we're seeing a sea change as a result of what we have set out to do. And so that is from our perspective. And let me say a quick note about, because you're discussing place-based initiatives. Part of the evaluation criteria that we have, of course, is looking at the sites that they're building and the locations that they're building, and make sure that we have some confidence that they will be able to succeed in those places, whether it's through their construction plans, whether through the workforce plans, or looking at the infrastructure to make sure that they can support such vast change in the ecosystem in terms of manufacturing in these regions. Semiconductor manufacturing is the most complex process that humanity has ever devised. Getting down to nanometer levels is incredibly difficult and is a miracle of science in many ways. So we were able to visit those places and make sure that those places were ready. I, having been from the industry, before I joined CHIPS, one of my responsibilities was to drive down a multi-billion-dollar manufacturing project, a greenfield manufacturing project here in the United States. So I had a bit of a unique perspective looking at what regions and what ecosystems were ideal and competitive for big companies and small companies to build manufacturing presence. Do they have the infrastructure? Do they have the workforce? Do they have the potential to grow? Do they have local authorities and that were willing to engage with the companies to make sure that problems will be solved along the way? These are all really important questions as to executing the vision of the overall picture of bringing some semiconductor manufacturing competitiveness back in the United States. So we could get into more details about that, but that's how we devised the program, making sure that there was a clear vision and a process for us to get there. And I think we have been successful in our goals there. Just a quick note to end on, Gordon. If I were to give advice as to the next generation of policy leaders in these programs. Early on, about midway through, I had a chance to speak with one of my European colleagues who was looking at the European Chips Act, which, a lot of different regions are looking at semiconductors because they all view it as critical and to support that industry. And he observed to me that one of the major differences between other regions, including Europe and others, and the United States and how they're going about the chip development is that there is a dedicated team at the Commerce Department solely for that mission, that there is a CHIPS program office. And that there is institutional muscle memory building happening there and expertise building there to make sure that this is a long-term success program. And not every country in their endeavors have that. And he sincerely hoped that we could take that into an advantage. And so my advice would be that this is an incredibly complicated, difficult thing that we are doing. We need to make sure that there is institutional strength and memory to execute this long-term. And to the extent possible, not let it become a victim of politics as much as we can. Meaning, projects will change. Some projects will not happen. Some projects will have to expand. This is just a cycle of the industry. This is just how technology industry works. We need an institution, a government institution, that is able to roll with that and to support it along the way, never forgetting the vision that we set up for ourselves. And so my advice would be to make sure that we keep that institutional memory and stability to the extent that we can, to keep the efforts going and build on the momentum that we created. Thank you.
Thank you, Dan. That was great. Really gave us insight into how you conceived of the program. The many aspects of it were novel in terms of how the federal government approached intervening in a specific industry, and the sense of what sort of continuity would need to be in place if we want to achieve long-term success. Since when you're talking semiconductors, the payoff comes way down the line. So with that, we'll jump to Alex, where, Dan, you're giving us a very specific industry's perspective. Alex, your experience with Build Back Better and focusing on the Regional Innovation Program, taking more of the region as the unit of analysis. And then Nellie, we're going to come back to you at the end to figure out how did Commerce put this all together in terms of a unified policy and under a unified strategy, and get it through the federal government and keep Congress on board.
Super. Thanks, Gordon, and thanks everybody for having us here and for joining. So yeah, I'm Alex Jones. I lead Build Back Better Regional Challenge for EDA. I'll give a bit of background and then kind of tick through your prompts here, Gordon. So Build Back Better Regional Challenge is funded through the American Rescue Plan Act. So in 2021, through ARPA, EDA got $3 billion allocation, and we kind of carved out a third of that, this $1 billion, for Build Back Better. And the kind of overall objective for our competition was that the kind of one of the ways we put it is to accelerate a generation's worth of economic development into 5 years. So it was really to take a significantly larger scale and more ambitious approach to regional economic development than EDA has been able to, has been resourced to in the past. And so, part of the kind of theory there is that sometimes these projects, these kind of enabling projects in regions, happen in kind of a trickle where they never actually achieve sufficient assets to compete in the given kind of cluster or sector that they're looking to. And so really what Build Back Better was all about was identifying really compelling regional visions for economic transformation, and then funding a series somewhere between 5 and 8 complementary projects to help them realize that vision. Ultimately, we were looking to award between $25 and $75 million to each of the regions that we selected. That was kind of the, that was the policy objective. I think there was also kind of a process objective in some ways through the competition itself, which was to provide an opportunity, provide kind of a moment for regions to come together in the application process itself. So we required coalitions to apply to the competition. So it couldn't just be a single entity. You had to apply as a full coalition. And then we also ran, which I'll talk about in a little bit, a two-phase competition where the kind of second phase of the application process was really an accelerated strategic planning process for these communities. So it was an opportunity for them, given pretty tight time constraints, to come together, to make commitments to each other, to form new partnerships, and to do really accelerated project development that would ultimately make up their phase 2 application. So we really had, we have this long-term big objective for the funding, but then I think it's also important to kind of note that the program design had kind of a process objective there that we think is pretty important for the kind of place-based policy that we were looking to pursue. Let me take maybe the kind of how we made decisions first and then go to the long-term evaluation, Gordon, just because it's the way it kind of flows. So to talk about how we ultimately made decisions. So we ran an open competition as Dan mentioned. We also had our NOFO, so the Notice of Funding Opportunity, kind of laid out the rules for the competition itself. But a few kind of important maybe design decisions that I'll pull out here that led us from an application pool of over 500 to ultimately the 21 regions that were selected. So one, as part of a two-phase competition, we had kind of a low barrier of entry for that first phase. So just a fairly basic 5-page concept note. That the intent here was to really open the funnel really wide and allow a lot of different regions, a lot of potential applicants to come in the door. Unlike CHIPS, we were totally industry agnostic. We were agnostic as to the kind of preconditions of any given place. Some competitions now that have come later are looking for kind of narrower swaths of potential applicants. Build Back Better had a really, really wide funnel. And that was the intent in phase 1, is to kind of get a lot of applications in the door. That kind of pool was then down selected to a group of 60 finalists. All those finalists received $500,000 of really planning and development funding that would allow them to continue working together and to develop their phase 2 application. And then we had this really accelerated, as I mentioned, kind of accelerated, we called good to great phase. People have heard that, the kind of between phase 1 and phase 2 process where they were doing application and project development while at the same time being deeply engaged with EDA via some technical assistance resources, via, weekly office hours. We were able to provide all 60 of them direct feedback on their initial phase 1 application, and that all led to the full phase 2 applications that came in for, as I said, around that $25 to $75 million level. And then just a couple other points on the kind of post phase 2 application and in the full evaluation process that I think are important lessons learned that we were able to do. These are things that were carved out in our NOFO. They're things that a lot of people can carve out. Sometimes we just don't have enough time to. One, we, after reviewing all the applications, the EDA team was able to submit what we called kind of clarifying questions to all 60 applicants. So it was kind of, we had the ability to have a bit of a two-way street. Dan alluded to this, in their process. I think it's really important when you're doing place-based work to be able to have a little bit of back and forth, maybe more so than is typical in a federal grant competition. So we were able to do kind of a back and forth with the grantees. We were able to do virtual at the time. This is 2020. I guess this is spring of 2022, so we still weren't traveling a bunch. So we did all virtual site visits with all 60, which was extremely helpful way to not just kind of follow up on any of those clarifying questions, but as I'm sure we might get to in the conversation, when we're talking about place-based policy, a lot of times what we're talking about is the networks of folks and the partnerships on the ground that are ultimately going to deliver this work, and the ability to get in a room, even a virtual room with all of those different partners and see them interact and hear them all kind of talk about the different parts of the application is incredibly helpful for validating some of what they're telling you in these applications. And I think it's like it was an extremely, extremely useful input to the decision-making process. And then the final thing I just want to point out, as Dan alludes to, having industry expertise is extremely important. The CHIPS team, very, very lucky that they are able to, were able to bring on board so much of that. Our competition, obviously, as I said, we were dealing in industries as wide-ranging as semiconductors to biotech to timber to advanced manufacturing. So we were able to tap industry experts within government and outside government to basically again do some validation on the assumptions and the claims that are being made in the applications. I think this is also really important to be able to carve out that space to do. One way that we were able to do that I do think is kind of a helpful lesson learned is we were pretty consistently trying to pursue transparency in our process. So the fact that we were able to make phase one applications public meant that then we could have public conversations with experts in these industries around phase one applications for finalists, where they weren't getting, any private application material, but they were only reviewing public material about these different regions. So quickly on kind of long-term evaluation, we've set up a few different channels to do the long-term evaluation here with our grantees. Luckily, under the American Rescue Plan, we had some funding for research awards. So EDA ended up making 3 different research awards to kind of ride alongside the Build Back Better implementation funding. One of those is our kind of long-term kind of outputs and outcomes partner. So this is Purdue University is running a quarterly survey for us where they get quantitative data from all of our funded coalitions on that quarterly basis. I have some lessons learned about this. I think one of the things that we all really need to acknowledge in place-based policy is that we are funding really, really complex local networks of actors, and that we need to think a lot about how the data kind of makes its way up those networks, ultimately to those who are going to report. So happy to maybe that might be a topic of conversation for later on, but they're kind of our main provider for the quantitative data that we get from the coalitions. And then we funded 2 kind of qualitative data partners or qualitative research partners. One was a short-term project through the Brookings Institution to really focus on that coalition building and governance process that I talked about, right? So we really thought that even just the competition process itself may have beneficial outcomes to these places, given that kind of strategic, the accelerated strategic planning and kind of coalition building process. So Brookings did some short-term work for us on that. And then we have some long-term work with the University of Michigan, looking specifically at the kind of benefits to underserved communities as a result of our investments. Final thing I'll say is just maybe 1 or 2 lessons that I have for other federal partners, and one kind of doubling down on Dan's. I think for one of our biggest lessons, especially here in post-award, is that place-based policies like this, place-based investments like this, are more complex and they require more staffing, especially in post-award. A lot of what we're asking places to do and funding them to do isn't just kind of set it and forget it after the money is out the door. It really requires programmatic support. It requires technical assistance from the program side of the federal partner, I really think, through the entire period of performance. And I think that's kind of a mindset shift in a lot of ways. One other thing, I have a couple, but one I will say that I think is important, especially as we're designing these kind of application processes and like doing program design, is that there's always people on the other side of your requests and always people on the other side of your applications. I think we often think about it as you know, we don't really have like a relationship with the applicants, or we don't like really have, we don't understand the consequences of our expectations sometime, and that is just for these place-based policies can be really amplified. Again, like, you know, we have one coalition lead organization, but that implicates 100 organizations locally in many of these regions. And I always tell people, like, to really understand the complexity and understand the number of people and people's full-time jobs that we're impacting by the different decisions that we make. Let me stop there and turn it back to you, Gordon.
Great. Thank you so much. And this is, I really appreciate the way in which you all are just giving us insight into the distinctive features of the organizational structures that you created, and the concepts behind that creation. Now, Nellie, you had to keep all of this going across a sprawling Commerce Department operation, and one in which the Commerce Department was doing things in new ways. So over to you in terms of how we understand kind of higher level strategy and policy in the operation of the whole portfolio of what happened in the last 4 years.
Yeah, thank you so much. And as Professor Hanson said, I'm the Director of Policy and Strategy in the Secretary's Office in the Department of Commerce, and I've been here since February 2021. Before that, I worked for Governor Gina Raimondo for a year, and before that, I led policy and research at the Roosevelt Institute economic think tank. And the overarching goal of what we've tried to achieve is U.S. economic competitiveness. The Secretary was very clear when she came into Commerce that that was her mission. People often talk about the Department of Commerce in previous administrations as being the voice of industry or business. She certainly has been interlocutor with voice and business, but she has viewed her mission as improving economic competitiveness, which requires engaging industry and working closely with industry, but also communities, workers, and taking a broader view there. And we can talk about the specific sort of competitiveness is obviously huge. Each of these programs has very specific goals, and you heard about some of those. I'm happy to talk about more, but I want to take a step back for a minute to talk about the context in which the Secretary came into the Department of Commerce, which is that she was very aware, and I think we've seen a massive shift in economic policy thinking across party, and which gave us the massive investments from the Hill and the political will from the Biden administration, that we face new challenges in the 21st century, and our existing policies and programs were not necessarily up to the task. And of course, Professor Hanson and Professor Roderick have been at the forefront of identifying some of these challenges and some of the tools we need. So it's a real honor to be here talking with both of you. But a couple of the challenges that we came into the department thinking about are, of course, the increasing national security and economic security competition with China. More broadly, tech and trade shocks that had impacted the U.S., and rising economic inequality, both across region, income, race. We could talk about more. There are different ways to think about these trends, but what the secretary's view and what her view of the highest best use of commerce is tackling all of these challenges really is about increasing U.S. economic competitiveness. So we can, both fuel our economic strength, our national security strength, and also raise standards of living. So CHIPS very clearly falls into that, right? We whatever our strategy was, it didn't work with the semiconductor industry. And there are huge national security imperatives for us to have that on our shores. What Alex talked about, Build Back Better, is one example of our regional competitiveness programs at EDA that are new. And they are much larger in scale and much more targeted in terms of strategy than anything EDA has done in the past. We're also, with broadband, we're making massive investments to connect communities, every community, to broadband. We can talk more, but what I will say all these have in common that I think is particularly distinct is that the scale, certainly, we never had the money at Commerce to operate at this scale before, but also the strategy. All of these programs say we have national goals that the government is going to articulate, and we are going to make big bets on companies or communities that give us a good plan on how they're going to achieve those goals. And that's different. Like when we came in, there was, a little bit of an allergic reaction from many long-time people across Commerce saying, you guys are trying to pick winners and losers. And this is super complicated. And I think we are not, we certainly didn't come in saying, we want this community to succeed and we want this company to succeed. But we came in saying, these are the goals we need to achieve. And that is going to require making big bets on individual companies and individual communities. So that is, I think we have articulated clear goals for our programs in ways that previously we didn't necessarily have to, because you could say, we care about innovation, give us a good proposal that's going to promote innovation and give people money. But it's very different. The successor program to Build Back Better Regional Challenges, Tech Hubs, which says, we care about advancing these technologies in the US. Tell us how you're going to do that. The Good Jobs Challenge says, we care about placing people in jobs that have high wages. Tell us how you're going to do that. Like very concrete goals. Dan did a phenomenal job articulating very concrete goals that we want to achieve with the CHIPS investments across, leading edge production, legacy production, ecosystem investment. On broadband, like in 2030, we're either going to have connected everyone or we haven't, and you will know if we failed or succeeded. So I just think the level of crispness around these goals and the sort of articulation of them is really as important as the amount of money we're putting behind them for what we've done. I'm going to talk very briefly about some of the operational work and what sort of lessons learned. My job is policy director and strategy director, but I probably spend 90% of my time on operations, which was a surprise to me. But as others have alluded, this is all new for Commerce. It's all new, or at least it hasn't been done in a long time for the US federal government. So getting the right answer is half the battle. And I come from think tank land. So I really care about getting the right answer. I just was had a total lack of understanding before I got to the Department of Commerce, how hard it was going to be to implement stuff. And I do think that's where Secretary Raimondo has been uniquely effective. It takes a lot of, I think, political courage to say, I'm going to do something risky. I'm going to state my objectives when there's like an allergic reaction from the establishment that I'm doing it wrong, I'm going to keep on pushing and pursuing. And it takes a lot of managerial competence to build new teams. You know, Dan, they have 150 people on CHIPS who did not work at the Department of Commerce 3 years ago. That's certainly been a challenge. So when I think about lessons learned and or like what I would want to see 10 to 15 years ago, I mean, from now, I'll just be from a personal level. I worked on policy and think tanks for, 10 years when the focus was, we need a new paradigm, we need new policies, we need to do this stuff that we're now doing. The challenge we had is then we got here and all of a sudden there was the political will and the money to do it. And we had like very little playbook on how to actually do it. And there's been an enormous amount of experimentation, not just at Commerce, I think across the federal government. And I hope that can serve as sort of a baseline for assessing what actually works and what doesn't. Like, where did we do a good job? Where, with more, if we had this opportunity again, would you want to do things differently? Which conditionalities in the CHIPS program were most effective at securing broad-based economic growth along with our CHIPS objectives, which were kind of just like frictions to getting deals done and we should totally disregard? Like, there's so many questions like that. When you think about other policy debates, like there's a massive world of think tanks who've studied budget implications, second order effects. There's a lot you can pull on. For all this new work, we're more limited. And we are, I think eager for this to be studied and for the brilliant minds on this call to next time, like take those lessons and do it better. I will say, I hope you're not starting from scratch next time. It would be a real shame, in my view, if this institutional capacity didn't get maintained. But I'll wrap there.
Thanks so much. You really hit at one of the central issues and central challenges in place-based policy looking back over the last century, is this issue of continuity. The federal government comes in and has to do new things at different moments in time, whether that's the Tennessee Valley Authority, whether that's mass producing penicillin during World War II, whether that's the moonshot, or now trying to bring semiconductor manufacturing back. And it's the in-betweens of all of those where some of those lessons get lost. And I want to kind of probe on a few of those things. So what I'll do is ask questions of each of the three of you, and then I'm going to turn to my colleague and co-director of the Reimagining the Economy Project, Danny Roderick, for some thoughts and for questions that he has. Alex, I'll start with you first, and then I want to wrap Nellie in to give a complementary answer to the same question. And that is, what's different from CHIPS and Build Back Better is CHIPS is you're trying to create an industry. And so it's this nicely encapsulated thing. It's not easy, but we know what the treatment unit is. It's semiconductor manufacturing capacity and capabilities and competitiveness. With Build Back Better, you chose 22 regions to get money. So that's not going to change overall local economic development in the United States. They're more, as I look at it, they has more the flavor of demonstration projects. How do we do this right in complex environments? Which means that the outcome of the project is partly improving outcomes in those 22 places, but the bigger payoff comes from how we learn how to do place-based policy better at a national level going forward. And so my question for you then is, as Dan has made clear kind of what needs to happen to keep the CHIPS Act moving forward. You want to keep that team. I heard we started at 200, then we got down to 150. Did we lose 50 people along the way? But keeping that team together is important. When it comes to Build Back Better, how do we think about knowledge accumulation and diffusion so the folks in West Virginia who got this money can transfer that knowledge maybe to Evansville, Illinois. And then, Nellie, I'll ask you to reflect on that at a higher level when you think about commerce overall, and we think about these transitions in style and emphasis across administrations. Is there a way in which that repository of knowledge can be more firmly rooted within the Commerce Department? Or is this just not a realistic thing? And this is really the job of think tanks and universities and other things to provide that reflection and that transmission of insight across time.
Thanks. I'm happy to start. So I think Nell kind of like alluded to this in some ways, which is I think a lot of the lessons learned and the knowledge transfer on the federal side for Build Back Better we're really seeing come to fruition in EDA's other new programs, which in many ways grew directly out of Build Back Better. So through Chips and Science, right, we got funded, we got authorized for both the Recompete pilot program and the Tech Hubs program, right? And so the way I kind of explain it is if you look at Build Back Better, as I mentioned at the start, we had this really wide aperture on the kind of potential applicant and the potential awardee, and Tech Hubs and Recompete have now kind of like come in and they've taken slices of those potential applicant pools and designed competitions that are very much based on how we ran our competition, but have slightly more kind of direction on where they ultimately want to head. So, you know, at EDA, we now are kind of more formalizing a national competitions team to bring all of these different sources of funding under one roof. I do think we've got the real opportunity to be able to kind of build that muscle and maintain that muscle for the agency looking forward. Gordon, the other kind of thing that you alluded to, which I think is a really good point, is like it's not just muscle memory on the federal side of learning how to do this. It's also muscle memory on the local side, right? So few regions even have been asked to do what we asked them to do in 2021 that I do think that there's a lot of benefit for maintaining that kind of capacity, like even the capacity to compete in these types of competitions is really important. I think over the past couple of years, I can say most of my awardees and plenty of people I know around the country are like, please don't release another NOFO for at least like 6 months, because between all of the commerce and NSF and everyone else, I think there's a bit of overload right now. But I do think it's a really good question of how, you know, we can maintain some of that muscle memory, some of that skill, frankly, that's been developed in regional intermediary organizations over the past 4 years, and have all those places be prepared, you know, whether it's the next time federal funding opportunities come down the pike, or, you know, frankly, I think all of us on here would agree that those types of kind of skills and muscles are important regardless of if it's federal funding you're pursuing or not. But yeah, I'll just, you know, I'll stop by saying, you know, I do think that Build Back Better was, in retrospect, in some ways, I think, very successful pilot that's now resulted in some you know, a number of competitions that have derived from it. But Nellie, go ahead.
Just one quick comment there on identifying regional intermediary organizations. This is probably the first thing we learned in diving into this work is how central those intermediary organizations are into the strategy and the conduct of a place-based policy. And the federal government has engaged with them in different ways for a very long time. And the fact that the EDA has codified an approach in what it has done is a very significant thing. And at some offline moment, we'll tell you about the data we're collecting to track the organizational capacity across places that would kind of match some of that memory that you're talking about.
Yeah, that'd be great.
And so Nellie, over to you as we think about, you know, Secretary Raimondo brought this quite new approach, which seemed to be emblematic of the way she had done things in Rhode Island, but also her earlier business experience. And now but commerce is a long-lived organization. And so as we think then about the challenge of continuity and the challenge of having that learning transmit across presidential administrations, would love to hear your thoughts.
It's an excellent question and something we think about a lot. I do believe that these the institution of commerce is transformed by having implemented these programs. There are new teams, there are new people, there are people who've been here for decades who have championed these approaches and have gotten to see them and will continue to champion these approaches. So I don't think it's about just the political leadership at this moment. I think there's a constituency within commerce now who will continue to be here. That said, I think there's also a huge set of external stakeholders who have a lot of investment in these programs. Partly the Hill, who actually, gave us the money to do them in the first place. As much as I like to think, Secretary Raimondo and all of us at Commerce are just geniuses, this is very much of the time and the moment and the political appetite, at least from several years ago. But even now, we just saw Tech Hubs receive $200 million more in funding a couple months ago in a very bipartisan initiative. So I do think there's political will on the Hill. There's external stakeholders in industry who it's been really interesting to hear, mostly from the manufacturing sector, how surprised they've been that all of these policies and tools, not just of commerce, but across the administration, have worked in terms of reshoring industry, whether it's tax credits or IRA investments or chips. And really, that's not just about commerce. Some of that's, about the Biden administration, some of that started in the previous Trump administration. And then you mentioned the think tank and nonprofit world. I think that's hugely important. The knowledge base is, again, like, we didn't have a huge amount to draw on. Professor Roderick's work was, central. Maria Mazzucato. There are some others, but there wasn't the sort of intellectual heft that we've seen on some of the other policies, like tax policies that have been around for 30 years. You can talk to millions of people. So I think there's a huge role for think tanks and nonprofits. Nonprofits also, I should say, not just the think tank universe, but the people actually doing this work on the ground. There's a number of philanthropy organizations, economic development organizations, intermediaries of different kinds that you mentioned, who have now begun to organize around this work in states, who I think will continue to try to pursue, whether it's the CHIPS work, the regional economic development work, some of the IRA investments, regardless what happens within commerce.
Great, thank you. We chose to start up with this project at a good time because there's a lot going on, and it just keeping us super engaged. Dan, my question to you before I turn things over to Danny. I was really struck by what you said about the importance of having the CHIPS program office, and it reminded me of two previous episodes of U.S. Industrial policy. One was during World War II, where we had to fund a whole bunch of stuff quickly, like create radio communications and radar and jet propulsion. And the long-run consequence of that was the creation of the National Science Foundation in 1950, and then the creation of federally funded research centers, and what really built the innovation ecosystem in the United States. So the one narrow mission then blossomed into something which created the template for the explosive innovation that happened in the US economy for decades after that. But then the moonshot is kind of the opposite story. The moonshot absorbed, accounted for several percent of GDP at its peak. And then we land on the moon and we're kind of done. And it goes away, and NASA becomes, I don't want to cast shade on NASA, but NASA's role in the federal bureaucracy in 1975 was really different than it was in 1969. So as you look at the CHIPS Act, what are things you see that are important for creating content, or that institutional foundation you've created being sustained, so that would push us more in the building the NSF mode than the kind of one and done moonshot mode.
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm gonna have to think deeply about that. I started here. I think I was like one of the first 3 or 4 employees at CHIPS. And now, somewhere between 150 and 200 people here, right? And I remember just sitting in an all-hands meeting at our auditorium here, just looking around and having this odd thought of, do you all really care about semiconductor manufacturing as much as I do? That is strange, right? Like, there's so many people here who have had phenomenal private sector success and experiences, who have chosen to put all of that on hold, right? And come work for federal bureaucracy, which is sometimes very difficult to do, right? And very, very frustrating to do. And yet they believed in the mission. And more so than anything else, building an institution that has a clear mission and people that are motivated to execute that mission, as long as that is there, I think it sort of leads to good sustainment. But at the same time, I think we have to recognize that there's phases to programs, right? So when we built CHIPS team, we built the team that are able to deal with more than 100 applications that would come through, creating a deal team and a set of experts within those deal teams to handle lots of different paper coming in and evaluating and strategizing and allocating funds. We've done a lot of that already, and most of it, I would say. So now the muscle has to shift to actually post-award work of tracking performance and dealing with changes. And so the organization even here has to shift with the long-term sustained mission. And to deal with that, changes in administration, changes in political focus. And so building good leadership within I think is really critical going forward. A lot of people, I would imagine, that is within the CHIPS program office now are not going to be here for the next 20 years. Many of them came here to execute short-term deals. They may have been asked to come here just for a few months or a couple of years. Just give us this time, lend us your expertise, sacrifice your private sector pay, and do this. And then when it's done, you could go back and and do what you were doing before, do something else. I think there's going to have to be this idea that if you come here, you're going to experience amazing things, and then you could go back or transition into something else that's also interesting. And I think you'll see some of that. One thing that strikes me as I've been executing the program here and with CHIPS, other than the quality of the people that I've been dealing with, I'm struck by the fact that I had a previous job in the U.S. government at the International Trade Commission covering the semiconductor industry. At the time, I was told that there were 2 people in all of federal government that were solely dedicated to semiconductor industry, and one was at the commission where I was working, and the other person, just one person, at the Commerce Department covering it, right? And so when an issue came up, and this was years ago, when an issue came up, like, there was no expertise within the federal government to really turn to, and so you had to sort of build all this muscle, and all of a sudden build a team of 150 to 200 people to execute this thing. And so it's been really gratifying for me to see that. I don't really know how something like a CPO, like CHIPS Program Office, could turn into an NSF type of thing. But it's something I'll think about, and I might have a good answer for you on that later on, Gordon. That's a good question.
Great. Thanks so much for that. Danny, over to you.
Thank you, Gordon. When you asked Dan the question about how do you maintain continuity, I couldn't help but think about this movie, Fly Me to the Moon. I don't know if any of you have seen it, this recent movie with Scarlett Johansson, and it's really about sort of how the So of course, one way you maintain and these agencies by by firing up the public imagination, and if you actually believe the story in the movie, Scarlett Johansson is playing this ad executive with a shady past, and she's brought on by the government to sort of to create all kinds of ploys to make the moon landing program sort of appealing and attractive, and sort of have it shown up. So I don't know, Dan, who you fancy playing you in the sequel on the CHIPS program, but I think that sort of is I really want to thank all of you for, I think your comments and were really incredible, and I also want to thank you big time for the work that you have done, which is really, I think, is to my mind really transformational. It is the U.S., as Gordon mentioned, has always had this history of experimentation and a kind of a developmental state a la East Asia, which often has been actually under the radar screen, not much talked about. I'm sure many of you know the work of Fred Block, the sociologist at UC Davis, who talks about sort of the US developmental state around institutions like the NIH and DARPA. And because it was all sort of, mostly on science and technology and innovation, and touched the productive sphere only indirectly, sort of that was okay, was going on. But I think what you all have done, and this incredible work in the previous administration that is directly touching on reshaping the structure of production, the structure of the American economy, and being very self-reflective about that, has been incredibly important, and I think one way or another will leave its mark. I have so many questions, but I I will ask sort of three questions. The first one is mainly directed to Dan. I think there's an interesting difference between the approach of the Commerce Department and EDA approach, which is based on sort of essentially a competition model, versus the CHIPS model, which was a pre-selection of, I think the way you put it was, identifying technologies that are most critical to have here. I think those were your words. So to the public, from the outside, this is one of, I think, is one of the most opaque parts of the process as to how you select those technologies. And there's a kind of a second layer of selection, which I don't know to what extent the CHIPS program office was involved, is how do you select technologies which is important to prevent other countries from getting access to. Just yesterday, the administration announced a sort of new sort of export controls on AI-related chips and so forth. But these are all sort of ex-ante selections, and often the criteria and the process by which this is done seems very, very opaque. So if you can tell us a little bit about how exactly you do that. The other two questions go to the heart of the central challenges of doing this kind of work, and that is how you navigate two different types of trade-offs. One is, well, when the sort of the conventional voices and economists were telling you or have been telling us that you can't do this kind of stuff, it's a no. They really have two types of objections. One is that you will never have the information to know to make the right selections, whether it's regions or communities or technologies. And the other one is that even if you did, that the process gets captured by political interest, and so other considerations will end up determining choices rather than the lofty goals that you started out with. Now, the operational implications of these two run in different directions, which is that if you're really concerned about lack of information, you really want to engage your partners, your clients very closely. But of course, the operational implication of worry about capture runs exactly in the opposite direction, which is you want to keep them at arm's length. You don't want to get too close with the people to whom you're giving money. So I would be interested to learn from each of your experiences how you navigated this tension. What kind of safeguards were there to ensure that you were engaging enough to get the information and the feedback that to make good decisions and selections, but that this wouldn't turn into capture, and that 5 years later there was a congressional sort of because one of these programs blew up, as happened with Solyndra, for example, that you could go out and there say, look, all the safeguards were in place. With to the extent that you can sort of provide concrete illustrations of that, that would be great. The other tension, I'm curious how you navigated, is I think there's, and this came out but wasn't made explicit in that there's a tension between what you do for national security, geopolitics, China, all that kind of stuff, and what you have to do for good jobs and for distressed regions and regions that were sort of being left behind. So how did you navigate that tension? Sort of in the way that you were making those decisions, that chips went really mainly for the first, and that the EDA went mainly for the second. Was that conscious? And yeah, so these were some of the questions that I had listening to your great presentations, and thank you again once more.
So why don't we go in order of Dan, Nelly, Alex, and then after we get your answers, I'm going to turn to Rachel, who was instrumental in bringing us all together today. I want also to kind of come back to this the fundamental issue of the constraint that local workforce presents in accomplishing all of these goals. Dan, to you.
Yeah, these are great questions. I'll have to come up with like a list of 3 actors I prefer to play me in the movie that Hollywood's going to make about our work. They will all be tall and handsome, unlike me, so it's going to be great. Thank you for that suggestion. I'll have to go watch that movie. How do we, to your words, pre-select technologies that we think are really critical? One thing to note is that we had a strategy going in terms of identification of those technologies, but we were open to learning, right? Because we had humility here to admit that we didn't know everything. We had good experts here that we were able to hire and bring on. But we realized that once we opened up our applications, that we were going to be educated, that we were going to be taken to school every day by the best minds in industry at every companies about the criticality of their technologies and their end uses. And so we couldn't be very rigid in terms of what we thought going in, that we had to be able to shift as we go forward. And we could have the best strategy and best plan in the world. If we can't activate the companies to do what we think is right and good, then we're not going to execute. And so we clearly had to open up a channel of communication with industry stakeholders to learn and to communicate our perspectives to them as well. And so we created a application system in which it was very iterative, right? A lot of communication with the companies. And so they would, of course, we opened up our criteria. They would submit applications to us. We were able to communicate with each of them along the way. There was a dedicated team for each company. And then when they came to us with their proposals, we even had a pre-application process in which, before they submit their full application, they would essentially give us a preview of the application. We'll give them a detailed feedback as to what we were looking for, strengths, weaknesses, and what we like to see more of. And there was this process, even in the full application process, where we would go back to the companies and say, we love this, we don't like this. Can you do more here? Can you do less here? Can you do, what can we do to provide you with a more detailed or more ambitious plan in this technology? And the companies were very good in terms of engaging that with us, because they understood what we were looking for. Because when we say to the world, we're looking for economic and national security, to a company, they don't really know what that means, really, right? Like, we were articulating a vision, we're articulating broad concepts, but if you're a company that has, say, an advanced packaging capability of 5 different types, well, which one is the US government really looking for, right? And to what degree are they looking for? And so we had an opportunity to engage with all of that. And so we did a lot of, we had technology and economic and market experts here doing a lot of economic analysis, just my term, to understand who's producing what, who's consuming what, and what the end use were, how substitutable are those products, how much of those products being made are being made at our allies versus some of the places that we thought were more risky, how much of concentration risk is there for these different types of products, what have we learned in the recent supply shortages in semiconductors, which ones really had problems, which ones did not. Which types of products, for example, have a concentrated set of customers that will send really clear economic signals. Leading edge, for example, has only a limited set of customers that are willing and able to pay for those technologies. But for lagging edge, things that have been around for 20 years, their prices are cheap enough where the set of customers is very broad. And so not one individual customer can't really send an economic signal to really signal a supply shortage or supply a resilience issue. So we looked at all those things and said, roughly, this is the technologies we need to focus on. These are the priorities. But when we open it up, we would always reconvene and say, now let's take a look at what the companies have to say. Do we need to change our thinking? And why or why not? What do we have in our portfolio that's missing? And what do we have too much of? How do we allocate that? So it is, we sort of recognize that we had a strategy, and our director here, used to have a quote that he would tell us that, everyone has a strategy until they get punched in the face, and that is a quote from Mike Tyson. So we had a plan going in, but we would get punched in the face all the time and saying, okay, now we were wrong about something, and we need to change that, but staying within the parameters of the vision that we laid out, right? And so we were able to sort of do that. But to your point, in being able to do that required us to have very strict ethical and engagement guidelines from internally, from our ethics attorneys and others, to make sure that those who were coming in were not had clearance in terms of ethics to be able to work in what we do. So, for example, I myself had to divest from all the stock holdings related to semiconductors. I couldn't really engage in anything in which I would be able to impact my personal finances. And I could say that for everyone that works here in CHIPS, the ethical, the considerations were all considered, and the engagement guidelines were all cleared in order for us to do that. And so it's a balancing line in terms of, we could have chosen to say, yeah, we're so afraid of the potential for capture, to your words, right, that we're not going to engage at all with the industry and just do what we think is right. Because we could have had a very adversarial stance and say, we're not going to engage that closely with the industry because they're the ones that caused this problem in the first place, right? And clearly they need our intervention, and therefore we're going to tell you what to do, and you better do it, and we're going to use all our sticks and carrots to get you there. But that is not what we did. We chose to engage with them enough to learn and for us to communicate and push back when we had to. And to really learn about why. And we were fortunate in a sense that most companies were very interested in the vision that we were laying out for the industry. I can't tell you how many times we heard the phrase, a strong US ecosystem is good for the world, right? That even when a company was faltering, their competitors would come to us and say, we need that company to be actually strong because they do really good things in this regard, and we benefit from that. So we can't have them be weak, right? So we got fortunate in that way. Of course, we had to deal with a lot of different voices and competition for funds, but I think we had the quality of staff in terms of our investments and other professionals to deal with all of that and really focus on that. So these are really, really good questions. The last things that I'll focus on is how do we deal with the tension of achieving our objectives versus sort of focusing on specific places. We had to recognize going into it that not all ecosystems within the United States could actually handle a large scale semiconductor manufacturing. Manufacturing of semiconductors is incredibly difficult. There are many countries in the world who have had a goal of manufacturing semiconductors, who have never been able to do it because they never got the infrastructure right, they never got the workforce right, because there's too much earthquake in that region or whatever else, right, in it. And so we had to recognize that we couldn't dictate to the companies, hey, you need to go to that distressed community and make semiconductors there because that's our focus. The first focus was for us to make sure that we had capability and capacity because it was important for national economic security. And the companies had to choose and do their due diligence as to what best places would allow them to do that. Some chose to go to places that were already thriving, that there were already semiconductor manufacturing there, and they wanted to sort of draft off the ecosystem that was built there. Others wanted to go off and create their own because they thought the other places were too crowded. And so whatever plans they had, we had to make sure that that they had a good plan in place for us to de-risk our risk of investing in those projects. But there was always a tension there. But quite frankly, if a company came to us and said, we're going to build the most sophisticated fab in the world in a place where there's no workforce strategy and there's no infrastructure built there, we will look at it and say, are you sure about that? Right? Because that's not our goal to go rescue distressed communities necessarily, but make sure that this actually gets produced in a way that is resilient, that provides resilience for everybody, everyone.
Nelly, over to you. I don't know if the information versus capture question was top of mind for you, but if you have something to say on that, I'd be really interested. Mindful that we've got about 12 minutes left and want to make sure that Alex gets a chance. And then we also want to make sure we get some thoughts from Rachel on the workforce.
Great, thank you. Yes, on the I think Dan gave a great answer on the capture versus engagement through chips. And I would imagine Alex would share a similar story with EDA. We've developed these iterative applications that allow us to have real engagement and conversation in the context of a competition. And then we have lawyers who keep us honest and make sure that we're actually, when we're evaluating applications, we stick to the measures we set out at the beginning. And so again, I think that my answer to that question and the question on distressed versus communities versus national security priorities are the same. Having very clear goals is important in the execution. Having very clear goals on what we're trying to achieve, I think limits the ability for capture, because you can't, with a straight face, or your lawyer certainly won't let you say, we're awarding this to this applicant to do this thing, if they can't reasonably claim that they've have a plan to achieve the goal. So the more vague your goal is, I think the more opportunity for capture there is. And then similarly on the different kinds of communities we work in, we've had to be very clear internally in the Department of Commerce, and then also sometimes externally to the distress of either our colleagues across the interagency or other stakeholders, when we're trying to achieve which goal. And even within EDA, different programs do different things. Tech Hubs is very much focused on advancing technology priorities, and they are not investing in distressed communities. These are like thriving cities that need an extra, or not always cities, but thriving communities that need an extra boost. There are other programs like Recompete that are more well suited for really depressed, distressed communities. And we're not claiming that we're going to bring those communities into being tech powerhouses. We just want to create good jobs and give people a chance to move forward. So I think that we have worked across the different levers we have to be clear on what lever achieves what goal. I'll turn it over to Alex.
Thanks. I'll try to tick through just quickly, because I do think there's a couple good points here. So one, like, totally on the information tension, I think Nelly's right that like it's really the benefit of these multi-phase competitions. So like for Build Back Better, getting to a finalist pool of 60 that we could engage with consistently and fairly, but quite deeply, I think resulted in significantly better applications that came in the door in phase 2, which means significantly better investments for EDA and for the country. I think one of the biggest risks with these competitions is, what if you get all bad applications? What if you have a finalist pool and then you don't have good applications to choose from? I think that would be a critical failure for EDA and for commerce. So I think the ability to have that deep engagement period is really, really important. And I think the way you do it fairly is by having a kind of down select to a smaller pool who can get all equivalent treatment. On the political capture question, my quick point would be, do it really, really fast like we did, and nobody notices, but that's not totally true. People still notice. But one thing we did do in Build Back Better, I will say, and I think Tech Hubs and Recompete and others have become really explicit on this too, is in some ways there's a way to like leverage that political interest to like really good means, which is we started asking for, we always get support letters, right, from all sorts of political constituencies. We said, like, we don't want form letters. Like, we won't consider form letters as a letter of support. And we did technical assistance during our application phase of what a good political commitment could look like a substantive commitment to advance this project. And we got very good responses to that. Like, people really heard that. And then we ended up in a lot of our applications, and this is true across all these programs, like getting substantive political commitments, not just of additional public dollars, but of policy commitments that will be, that are changes at the state or the local level that are actually resulting in these applications, the likelihood of their success being higher, which I think is a really good learning from us. And then what's the final one? Oh, just for equity versus competitiveness. Nellie's totally right that I think that in EDA, like, we've now moved to programs that are explicitly designed for those different slices. I'd say for Build Back Better, what we were able to do, and I think, I do think overall this is really important for place-based programs, is like we very much had a portfolio approach. So like we were able to consider not just each individual application on its own, but then also the overall portfolio of what Build Back Better was going to invest in. And I think if you look across that portfolio, you'll see a diversity of places, which is why, as I kind of alluded to earlier, you see some that look more like a Recompete program community. You see some that look more like a Tech Hub community.
Great, thank you. So Rachel, I wonder if we might close with you. What we've heard today is a fascinating, conceptually rich insider's account of how the Commerce Department built new capabilities to massively engage with a particular industry, to think about ways of intervening in a very diverse set of communities. And throughout all of this, making sure that the workforce is present or will be present is essential for ultimate success. But workforce isn't the domain of commerce. Not exactly clear where workforce resides in the federal government, because so much of career and technical education happens at the state and local level, funded via community colleges and regional universities. So just would like to give you a chance to offer some thoughts on kind of that dimension of the novelty of what the Commerce Department has done in the last several years.
Thanks, Gordon. Happy to. And since it sounds like I'll be closing out before I go, let me first just say thank you to you guys for pulling this together. You can probably see, as sad as I was to leave the great group, my last gig of colleagues, I'm blessed now to work with an equally set of brilliant folks and committed public servants. And it's been one of the best parts of being here at Commerce at this time. Is just the talent of the people who have been brought in, and their true commitment to driving forward what's good for the country. So hopefully the folks on the line are getting a good a pulse for that. Gordon used the word competency in the question, and I think that's part of what the story is about Commerce's role in workforce over the last 4 years. It's not brand new that the Commerce Department has had a role in federal workforce policy, right? I mean, we house the Census Bureau. We've always been a data center. We have assets like Manufacturing USA, the manufacturing extension partnerships that are closely engaged with the employer community, and Nellie referenced earlier sort of the historical role of commerce being close to the business community. I think obviously what's been different over the last 4 years is that commerce has been a significant investor in workforce policy in ways that align with all of the themes that you've heard today. The number that we have as of this week is 2.9 billion that Commerce has spent across the department over the last 4 years on workforce development investments, which I think makes us a pretty significant player at the federal level. And maybe I can highlight a few ways that I think our approach has been distinctive or unique compared to certainly the department in the past, but also some of the ways federal workforce monies have traditionally. First, I want to start with the emphasis on national and economic security that you heard across the conversation today. I think is also core to the workforce conversation, and I think commerce has played a role in framing workforce development as a national and economic security issue. That if we don't have the workers that are needed to push forward these critical and emerging technologies, strategically critical industries for the country, we won't be able to succeed in our efforts. And that means in a lot of ways, like being able to make some big bets on workforce development for those particular industries at a national level that's of course deployed through places. And I think that if you look at a lot of the traditional large sources of federal funding for workforce development, they haven't necessarily flowed in that way. There's a lot of kind of voucher-based programs where the individuals are, selecting in to say, here's what I want to study, versus if we have a strategy here on, hey, semiconductors are important, or these other critical and emerging tech fields are important, how do we deploy workforce initiatives that align there? The second thing you'll see is we're doing workforce development and economic development together, of course. I mean, that's obvious based on the Commerce Department's mandate, but obviously I think there's a lot of strengths towards that approach. It looks different in, say, CHIPS, where we're investing directly in companies and workforce efforts versus like Recompete, where you're trying to build a new industry that spurs out new jobs in regions that have been struggling. That's been a key feature of the efforts. And finally, I'd say like this coalitional model, that is the idea that it's not just one entity that's going to deliver on a workforce strategy for a region. Whether it be the CHIPS companies or the EDA programs, you'll see kind of how do you table set so that you can have a whole set of different partners that are working together, typically convened by an intermediary, towards a shared strategy to actually deliver on the workforce goals. And that's I think an interesting model that is going to persevere. Final thing I'll say, and then I know we're at time, is that Secretary Raimondo's vision here, what you heard earlier about goals and being clear about what we're trying to achieve, that extends to workforce too. And she's been really focused that at the end of the day, it's about a worker landing in a good job. And that needs to be measured across all of our programs. That needs to be how our workforce decisions are judged. And I think that is a simple statement, but actually really will go a long way in shaping how future federal policy can evolve from here.
Thank you very much, Rachel, and thanks for your efforts in helping bring this team together today. And I just want to close with a deep note of thanks to Dan, to Nellie, to Alex, and to Rachel for helping make this possible. It's immensely helpful to us as we try and understand the way in which place-based and industrial policy is evolving in the U.S. Excited to learn about your work, and we'll be continuing to deepen our understanding and learn from your efforts as we go forward. So thank you very much. We'll be posting this online to make this available to folks who weren't able to be here in real time today.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you all.